He brought his mistress to the investor dinner and made sure his wife had a seat in the back. The ballroom on the 38th floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel glittered like it had been polished for betrayal. Crystal lights hung over white tablecloths. Champagne moved through the room in narrow glasses. Outside the windows, New York shimmered in gold and steel, the kind of view Richard Hale loved because it made every man in the room feel taller than he was. He entered late on purpose. Everyone knew that. Men like Richard did not arrive, they staged arrivals. His black tuxedo fit perfectly, his smile was practiced, and on his arm was Vanessa Cole, wrapped in a silver dress that caught every flash from the cameras near the entrance. He did not hide her. He guided her forward with his hand resting lightly at her waist, stopping just long enough for photographers to get the picture he wanted the city to see by morning. The founder of Hale Tech, the rising king of private software security, the man about to secure the investment that would save his company from the kind of quiet financial trouble no press release ever admitted. And beside him, not his wife. Claire Whitmore watched from the last table near the service doors, where the air smelled faintly of coffee, linen starch, and expensive flowers beginning to wilt under warm lights. Her place card sat in front of her like a small insult printed in black ink. Mrs. Hale, guest. She looked at it for 1 second too long, then laid 2 fingers on the card and turned it face down. No one at her table noticed. They were junior analysts, assistants, one nervous publicist checking her phone every 15 seconds. To them, Claire was just a quiet woman in an ivory dress, pearl earrings, and no visible claim to the room. That was how Richard wanted it. Across the ballroom, his eyes found hers. For half a breath, the smile on his face changed. Not disappeared. Sharpened. He looked almost pleased, as if the night had handed him one final decoration. He leaned toward Vanessa, whispered something, and she glanced at Claire with a soft little smile that tried to look innocent and failed. Then Richard began making his rounds. Handshakes. Laughter. A clap on a senator's shoulder. A warm greeting to a venture partner from Boston. He moved like a man who believed every door in America had been built to open for him. When he reached the center of the room, he lifted a glass, and the conversations folded into silence. A server stopped beside the wall. Someone lowered a fork onto porcelain with a delicate click. Richard stood beneath the cold white spotlight, Vanessa beside him, her hand curved around his arm. Tonight, he said, his voice smooth enough to sell Elia's vision, is not just about capital. It is about loyalty. It is about choosing the people who truly stand beside your future. He paused, letting the words settle. Then he looked down at Vanessa as though she were proof of something. A few people smiled politely. A few looked away. Claire did neither. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm enough to make the room feel louder around her. Richard's gaze drifted toward the back table. He knew exactly where she was seated. He had made sure of it. Some people, he continued, are present at the beginning of a story, but not everyone is meant to be there when it finally reaches the top. The sentence moved through the ballroom like a blade wrapped in velvet. A low ripple of laughter rose from one corner, nervous and cruel. Vanessa lowered her eyes, pretending modesty. Richard smiled wider. Claire felt every face turn just slightly, not enough to be obvious, enough to make the humiliation public. She could have stood. She could have corrected him. She could have reminded that room who wrote the first investor deck, who balanced payroll when Hale Tech had 12 employees and a leaking office in Queens, who sold her mother's watch to cover the company's first legal retainer. But she did not move. Her silence was not weakness. It was timing. Beneath the table, her phone lit up against the white cloth. One message, no name visible to anyone but her. 5 minutes. Claire read it once. Then she turned the screen down, lifted her water glass, and took a single slow sip while Richard Hale toasted to a future he no longer controlled. Claire did not. Look at Richard again after the toast. That was what unsettled him first. He expected pain to have a shape he recognized, a trembling hand, a pale face, a woman leaving the room before dessert because the humiliation had done its work. Instead, she sat beneath the softened glow of the chandeliers with her shoulders relaxed and her face unreadable, as if his words had arrived too late to matter. The analysts at her table tried not to stare. One young man from Chicago loosened his tie and pretended to read the dinner program. A woman from public relations kept glancing between Claire and the stage, her thumb frozen over her phone screen. Everyone understood that something uncomfortable had happened, but no one understood that something much larger was already in motion. Richard stepped down from the platform to polite applause, and Vanessa leaned close to him, laughing at something he had not said. She was good at that, laughing at the right moment, touching his sleeve when cameras were near, making ambition look like romance. Richard loved being admired in public. He loved rooms where people waited for him to speak. He loved the thin, bright sound of money pretending to be loyalty. Claire had loved him once before all of that became his oxygen. She remembered a different Richard, standing barefoot in a cramped apartment in Queens, reading rejection emails from banks at 2 o'clock in the morning while rain tapped against the window air conditioner. Back then, he had not owned a tuxedo. His suits came from outlet racks. His confidence cracked whenever a meeting went badly, and he used to ask Claire to read every sentence before he sent anything important. She had sat beside him at a kitchen table with one uneven leg, marking up pitch decks while coffee burned in a $10 machine beside the sink. She knew where the first numbers came from because she had built them. She knew which investor had said no twice, which supplier had nearly walked away, which employee received a paycheck 3 days late because Richard had refused to admit the account was empty. He told the world Hailtech was born from his vision. Claire knew it had survived because she learned how to make fear look like discipline. When vendors called, she answered. When payroll tightened, she trimmed every expense before anyone noticed. When Richard panicked, she lowered her voice and handed him the next solution. For years, she stood just outside the spotlight, not because she lacked ambition, but because she believed marriage meant guarding the fragile parts of another person until they were strong enough to stand. She did not realize he would one day mistake her protection for emptiness. At the front of the ballroom, Richard moved from guest to guest with Vanessa at his side, introducing her as if she were proof that he had upgraded every part of his life. Claire watched him accept congratulations from people who had never seen him afraid. Her phone remained face down beside her fork. The message still pulsed in her mind. 5 minutes. She did not need to check the time. Years of waiting had taught her the weight of a minute. A waiter approached with wine, and she covered the rim of her glass with 2 fingers. "No, thank you," she said softly. Her voice was steady enough that the waiter gave a small nod and moved on. Across the room, Richard noticed the gesture. For the briefest second, irritation crossed his face. Claire was supposed to be shrinking. She was supposed to be wounded in a way he could enjoy from a distance. But she sat there like a woman attending a meeting, not a funeral for her dignity. Then Vanessa looked over and raised her glass, a delicate little salute dressed as kindness. Claire gave no answer. She only lowered her eyes to the folded program in front of her, where Hailtech's future valuation had been printed in silver letters on thick paper. The number was beautiful. The truth beneath it was not. And Claire, more than anyone in that room, knew exactly where the cracks were hidden. The final insult did not come with shouting. It came with a seating chart, a smile, and a microphone. Claire had learned that public cruelty in rooms like this rarely raised its voice. It wore cufflinks. It thanked sponsors. It came printed on thick paper with gold borders. Richard returned to the stage after the first course, his confidence warmer now. Loosened by applause and the reflected glow of people who still believed he was the safest bet in the room. Behind him, the screen displayed Hailtech's projected growth in elegant upward lines, smooth and shining, with none of the jagged truth underneath. Claire looked at the graph and saw the missing invoices, the delayed vendor payments, the consulting fees routed through a firm Vanessa had recommended, the emergency credit line Richard had described as strategic flexibility. Numbers never lied. People only arranged them under better lighting. Richard tapped the microphone once, and the room quieted again. "Before we move into the investment presentation," he said, "I want to acknowledge the people who helped Hailtech become what it is today." For one dangerous second, Claire felt the past move inside her chest. Not hope, something older and more foolish. A memory of him in a wrinkled shirt, holding her hand under that broken kitchen table in Queens, promising that when the company made it, everyone would know what she had done. But the man on stage was not that man anymore. Or perhaps he had always been this man, and poverty had only made him seem humble. Richard smiled toward the front table where Vanessa sat beneath the best light in the room. Some people understand vision only when it becomes comfortable, he said. Others recognize it early enough to stand beside it. Vanessa lowered her chin, accepting the room's attention like a gift. A few guests clapped. Claire remained still. At her table, the publicist inhaled softly, as if she knew the sentence had landed somewhere it should not have. Richard let the applause fade, then turned his gaze toward the back of the ballroom. This time, he did not glance by accident. He aimed. And some people, he added, confuse being present with being essential. A thin laugh escaped from someone near the bar, the kind of laugh people used when they wanted to stay on the winning side. Claire felt it pass over her skin, light as cold dust. Vanessa's eyes found hers across the room. There was no open cruelty there, only satisfaction polished smooth enough to seem harmless. Richard continued speaking, but his words became distant for a moment, swallowed by the quiet click of Claire's memory. The first office. The first tax notice. The first time he had come home terrified because a partner threatened to pull out, and she had sat on the floor beside him until sunrise, rebuilding the proposal page by page. He had called her brilliant then. Later, when the money came in, brilliant became supportive. Supportive became domestic. Domestic became invisible. Claire placed her hand beside the folded place card, not on top of it, not touching the printed name she no longer accepted. Her phone lit up again beneath the edge of her napkin. 3 minutes. She did not smile. She did not look toward the entrance. She simply lowered her hand to cover the screen and listened as Richard walked closer to his own undoing. Tonight is about the future, he said, lifting his glass once more. And I am proud to say I finally understand who belongs in mine. He turned slightly toward Vanessa. The applause came louder this time, because people trusted confidence when it stood in a tuxedo. Claire stood before anyone expected her to. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for the chair legs to whisper against the carpet. The sound was small, but at her table, every conversation stopped. Richard paused, his glass still raised. For the first time that evening, his expression flickered. Claire picked up the place card that said Mrs. Hale, guest, looked at it as though it were a receipt for something already returned, and set it neatly inside the dinner program. Then she sat down again. No speech, no accusation, no performance, only a correction no one yet understood. Richard recovered with a short laugh, but it arrived half a second late. That was enough. Across the ballroom, near the tall double doors, a hotel manager adjusted his jacket and leaned toward the security captain. The doors had not opened yet, but the room seemed to sense a change before it could see one. Claire folded her hands in her lap. Richard went on talking about loyalty, legacy, and leadership. He did not know that in 2 minutes, every word would belong to someone else. For years, Claire had known the difference between being unseen and being unimportant. Richard had never learned it. In the early days of Hale Tech, before the hotel ballrooms and the polished speeches, the company fit inside one rented office above a dry cleaner in Queens, where the radiators hissed all winter and the conference room door stuck whenever it rained. Richard used to call it temporary, always temporary, as if naming discomfort made it easier to survive. Claire never corrected him. She was too busy making temporary things last. She kept the books on a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner. She answered investor emails before sunrise because East Coast bankers liked discipline and West Coast funds liked speed. She brought sandwiches to the office when the team worked through dinner, and when the account balance dropped below $3,000, she smiled through payroll calls so no one would hear the fear in the room. Richard sold the dream. Claire kept the dream from collapsing under its own weight. She remembered the night the first major investor almost walked away. Richard had thrown the proposal across their kitchen table, not at anyone, just into the mess of paper, panic, and cold coffee. He said no one respected him. He said maybe men like him were not meant to build companies. Claire had sat across from him in an old college sweatshirt, her hair still damp from the shower, and pulled the pages back into order one by one. She did not comfort him with empty words. She rebuilt the financial model, cut the fantasy from the projections, added 3 realistic paths to profitability, and wrote the sentence that would become the heart of Hale Tech's first successful pitch. By morning, Richard was sleeping on the couch, and Claire was still awake, highlighting risk factors in pale yellow. 2 weeks later, he stood in front of investors and called the work his instinct. She let him, not because she was weak, but because love had made her generous in places where she should have been careful. That was the version of herself she thought about now, sitting in the back of the Meridian Grand Ballroom, while her husband praised another woman beneath a chandelier worth more than their first year of rent. The memory did not break her. It clarified her. She saw how gradually a woman could be erased when she mistook silence for peace. First, Richard stopped saying we in interviews. Then he stopped inviting her to meetings. Then her name disappeared from internal stories. Then from company anniversaries. Then from the way he remembered his own life. Each omission had been small enough to forgive alone. Together, they built a room where he could humiliate her and believe she had no door out. But Claire had built doors for men who never thanked her. Building one for herself had only taken discipline. 6 months earlier, after finding Vanessa's name attached to unnecessary consulting invoices and private travel expenses disguised as client development, Claire had stopped asking Richard questions he would only answer with charm. She copied what belonged to her, preserved what belonged to the company, and returned to the work she had once abandoned for marriage. Under her maiden name, Claire Whitmore, she took a contract review position at Brooks Capital, 3 subway stops, and a lifetime away from the house Richard still called theirs. No one there cared whose wife she had been. They cared that she could read a balance sheet and hear the confession hiding between the lines. They cared that she found risk in footnotes senior partners skipped. They cared that she spoke softly and missed nothing. Back in the ballroom, Richard continued his speech, unaware that the woman he had seated near the service doors had already reviewed every number on the screen behind him. Claire looked at the glowing valuation, then at Vanessa's satisfied smile, then at the double doors where the hotel manager stood straighter than before. Her phone lit for the 3rd time. 1 minute. Claire slipped it into her small ivory clutch and placed both hands on the table, calm and empty. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to look directly at Richard, not as a wife waiting to be recognized, not as a woman wounded by his performance, as the one person in the room who knew exactly how much his future was worth, and exactly who had the authority to decide whether he would keep it. The first person at Brooks Capital who truly understood Claire was not Nathaniel Brooks. It was a senior associate named Maren Doyle, a woman with silver-framed glasses, a sharp bob, and a habit of reading footnotes before introductions. On Claire's 3rd week there, Maren dropped a distressed acquisition file on her desk at 7:15 in the morning and said, "Tell me why this deal smells wrong." Claire had not asked for responsibility. She had only asked for work. Still, she opened the file, smoothed the first page with her palm, and began reading while the city outside the office windows shifted from blue dawn to pale gold. By 10 o'clock, she had found the problem. By noon, she had traced it through 3 subsidiaries and 2 consulting agreements. By 3, she had written a clean summary that did not accuse anyone, but made denial impossible. Maren read it once, then walked it down the hall to Nathaniel Brooks himself. That was how Claire first met him, not at a gala, not over champagne, not in some shining place designed for admiration, but in a glass conference room overlooking Madison Avenue, with cold coffee beside her laptop and a stack of marked documents at her elbow. Nathaniel was not what Richard would have called impressive at first glance. He did not perform power. He wore a charcoal suit, no flashy watch, and listened with the stillness of a man who had learned that most people revealed themselves when no one rushed them. He asked Claire one question. "How did you know where to look?" Claire glanced at the file, then at the projection on the wall. "People hide fear in round numbers," she said. "And they hide favors in vague language." No one spoke for a moment. Maren smiled without looking up. Nathaniel closed the folder and said, "Then we should give you more fear and more vague language." From that day, Claire's desk changed. The routine contracts disappeared. The impossible files arrived. Retail chains with beautiful storefronts and broken margins. Medical technology startups with charming founders and unpaid vendors. Real estate portfolios dressed up with optimistic assumptions. Claire learned to live inside the quiet architecture of risk. She came in before sunrise, left after the cleaning crew began moving through the halls, and took the subway home with ink on her fingers and calm in her chest. It was not glamorous, but it was hers. No one called her supportive. No one asked her to smile beside a man and disappear. They asked what she saw, and then they listened. That kind of respect did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like oxygen returning to a room after years of being slowly removed. Nathaniel never pried into her marriage. He never asked why she still wore no ring and still paused before signing her name, as if reclaiming it required muscle memory. But one evening, when most of the office had gone dark and Manhattan glittered below them in long yellow lines, he stopped by her desk with a file stamped confidential. "Hailtech is seeking emergency capital," he said. Claire's hand stilled over her keyboard. Only for a second. Nathaniel noticed, but did not soften the truth. "You know the company?" he asked. Claire looked at the logo on the folder, the same blue mark she had once approved in a kitchen full of unpaid bills. "I helped build it," she said. The sentence cost her nothing now. That surprised her. Nathaniel sat across from her, not as a rescuer, not as a judge, but as a chairman speaking to the one person in the room who might understand the risk better than anyone alive. "Then I need to know whether you can review it without personal bias." Claire looked through the glass wall toward the city, where every light seemed to belong to someone who had survived something quietly. She thought of Richard's interviews, Vanessa's invoices, the erased years, the place card that would one day call her a guest in a company she had held together with both hands. Then she turned back to Nathaniel. "No," she said, "I cannot review it without history, but I can review it with accuracy." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, then slid the file across the table. "Accuracy is what I am paying for." Back in the Meridian Grand Ballroom, that same file existed in a cleaner form, bound in black leather and carried by a Brooks Capital legal officer waiting behind the double doors. Richard did not know that. Vanessa did not know that. The board members smiling over dessert did not know that the future of Hailtech had already passed through Claire's hands line by line. She looked toward the entrance as the handles turned. The room continued applauding Richard, but Claire heard something else beneath it. The quiet arrival of a truth that had taken 6 months to dress itself properly. The doors opened without ceremony, and that was what made the room feel colder. No trumpet of arrival, no dramatic pause, no spotlight chasing the entrance. Just 2 hotel staff members stepping aside as Nathaniel Brooks walked into the ballroom with a Brooks Capital legal officer on his left and Marin Doyle on his right, carrying the black leather file that had consumed 6 months of Claire's life. Richard saw Nathaniel and brightened instantly, as if salvation had arrived wearing a charcoal suit. He lowered his glass, widened his smile, and moved down from the stage with the practiced warmth of a man ready to embrace money. "Nathaniel," he called, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Perfect timing. But Nathaniel did not go to him. He gave Richard a brief nod, polite enough to be unremarkable and distant enough to be devastating. Then continued walking past the front table, past Vanessa's silver smile, past the board members already half rising from their chairs. The sound in the room changed. Applause thinned into confusion. Forks paused over plates. A photographer lowered his camera, then lifted it again because instinct understood what etiquette did not. Claire remained seated at the back table, hands folded, eyes steady. She had imagined this moment in 100 practical ways while preparing the due diligence report, but never as revenge. Revenge was too loud a word for what she had done. She had reviewed bank statements. She had matched vendor payments to delivery records. She had identified unapproved expenses coded as strategic development, consulting retainers with no measurable output, and board disclosures written with more confidence than truth. She had not invented Richard's problem. She had simply stopped standing between him and the consequences. Nathaniel reached her table, and only then did Claire stand. Not as the woman Richard had hidden, not as the guest he had mislabeled, as the person Brooks Capital had trusted to decide whether Hailtech deserved another chance. Nathaniel inclined his head, a gesture small enough for business and respectful enough to rearrange the room. "Claire," he said. One word. Her real name. The name Richard had spent years turning into a footnote. Marin stepped beside her and placed the black leather file on the table. The junior analysts seated there stared as if the wallpaper had just spoken. Richard stopped halfway across the ballroom, his smile still on his face, but no longer connected to anything beneath it. Vanessa looked from Nathaniel to Claire, then down at the file, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Claire noticed without satisfaction. The night was not about Vanessa. It had never been about Vanessa. She was only the polished surface of a deeper failure, the pretty distraction Richard held up while numbers bled quietly behind him. Nathaniel turned toward the stage and spoke with the calm authority of a man who never needed a room to lean closer. Before we proceed with the announcement, there has been an adjustment to the order of presentation. The board chairman, seated near the front, straightened so abruptly his napkin slid from his lap. Richard laughed once, too lightly. Of course, whatever Brooks Capital needs. Claire heard the old rhythm in his voice, the charm he used when a negotiation moved beyond his control. It had worked on lenders, reporters, employees, even on her once, back when she thought confidence and character were made of the same material. Nathaniel looked toward the back table again. Our lead strategist should not be seated by the service doors. The sentence landed cleanly. No insult, no accusation, just a fact sharp enough to cut through every lie the seating chart had tried to tell. Claire picked up her ivory clutch with one hand and the leather file with the other. Around her, chairs shifted. People stood not because anyone asked them to, but because power had quietly changed location. As she walked toward the stage, the ballroom lights seemed less warm than before, the crystal overhead less forgiving. Richard watched her approach with the stunned focus of a man seeing a familiar door open into a room he had never known existed. When she passed him, he said her name under his breath, almost like a question. Claire did not stop. She climbed the 3 shallow steps to the platform, placed the file beside the microphone, and looked out over the room that had laughed at her 3 minutes earlier. Then she opened the cover, and the first page showed the Brooks Capital investment summary with one signature line already waiting. Claire Whitmore, Lead Investment Authority. For one suspended second, Claire heard nothing at all. Not the clink of silverware, not the soft gasp from the front table, not the camera shutters that began to flutter like nervous wings. She saw only the page in front of her, the printed line beneath her name, and the tiny black dash where her signature would decide the future Richard had tried to parade without her. Then the room came back in pieces. A chair scraped near the wall. Someone whispered, Lead Investment Authority. Vanessa set her glass down too quickly, and the champagne trembled at the rim. Richard stood at the foot of the stage with his hands slightly open, as if he had reached for control and found only air. Nathaniel stepped to the microphone first, not to rescue Claire from attention, but to give the room a proper reason to listen. Brooks Capital has completed a 6-month review of Hailtech's financial position, governance practices, and strategic risks, he said. His tone was calm, almost mild, which made every word feel heavier. Based on that review, we are prepared to move forward with a primary investment package of $75 million, contingent upon revised oversight terms. The number moved through the ballroom like electricity under polished floors. $75 million was not a rumor. It was not charity. It was the difference between Hailtech surviving the quarter and explaining failure to every lender from New York to San Francisco. Richard blinked hard, then recovered enough to smile for the crowd. That is tremendous news, he said, taking one step toward the stage. We are grateful for the confidence. Claire looked at him then. Not sharply, not coldly, just fully. It was the kind of look that did not ask a man to be better. It simply measured who he had already chosen to become. Nathaniel did not move away from the microphone. The confidence, he said, is in the company's underlying product, its engineering team, and the corrective plan prepared by Ms. Whitmore. The name did what no accusation could have done. It changed the temperature of the room. Ms. Whitmore, not Mrs. Hale, not guest, not Richard's forgotten wife. Claire's own name stood in the air with more dignity than any title he had ever offered her. A few people turned toward the back table, where her place card still lay hidden inside the dinner program like evidence of a failed insult. Vanessa's face had gone still, her smile resting there without purpose. Richard looked at Claire's left hand, at the absence of a ring, then at the file. He seemed to understand several things at once and none of them completely. Claire, he said quietly, but the microphone caught enough of it for the first rows to hear. There was a plea in the shape of her name now. It arrived too late to be useful. Claire placed one hand on the open file. The paper was thick beneath her fingers, cool and real. Brooks Capital's investment is not a celebration, she said. Her voice was steady, lower than Richard's had been, but the room leaned toward it anyway. It is a rescue, and rescues require honesty. No one laughed now. The same guests who had smiled at Richard's little wounds folded their hands and stared forward as if posture could erase participation. Claire continued without raising her voice. Hailtech has valuable technology, loyal employees, and recoverable market position. It also has governance failures that can no longer be disguised as growth pains. Richard's jaw tightened. Vanessa glanced toward the nearest exit, then back at the cameras. Claire did not mention her by name. She did not need to. Marin opened a second folder and placed it beside the first. Effective upon signature, Claire said, Brooks Capital will receive board-level oversight, approval authority over executive spending, and veto power on strategic contracts above $250,000. The board chairman's face drained of color, but he nodded because he already knew. Men like him always knew before they admitted they knew. Richard stepped closer. This is not what we discussed. Nathaniel turned toward him. It is what your board approved this afternoon. That sentence silenced him more completely than anger ever could. Claire looked down at the signature line again. The fountain pen beside it had a black lacquer body and a silver clip. She picked it up, feeling its weight settle between her fingers like a small, elegant verdict. Richard watched her as if she might still save him from the room. For years, she had done exactly that. She had softened his panic, rewritten his failures, protected his image, and made his ambition look cleaner than it was. But protection was not love when it required a woman to disappear. Claire signed her name in a clean, unhurried line. Claire Whitmore. The cameras flashed. Richard flinched, not from harm, but from exposure. And at the edge of the stage, Vanessa finally lowered her eyes. The signature changed the room before anyone said another word. Claire set the pen down with care, aligning it beside the folder as if order itself had become part of the verdict. The cameras kept flashing, but she did not turn toward them. Public attention had once frightened her because Richard had made it feel like a stage where she could only fail. Now it was simply light, and light was useful when a room had spent too long protecting shadows. Nathaniel stepped slightly aside, leaving the microphone to her, but his presence remained steady near the edge of the platform. Marin stood with the second folder open, her silver-framed glasses catching the chandelier glow. Claire looked first at the board, not at Richard. The revised oversight terms also include an immediate internal review of executive spending, vendor selection, and conflict disclosures from the previous 18 months, she said. The board chairman closed his eyes for half a second, the way a man does when a truth he has delayed finally enters the official record. Richard moved closer to the stage. Claire, this is excessive, he said, still trying to keep his voice low enough to sound controlled. But the microphone caught the edge of it. The room heard his first real fracture. Claire looked down at him, and for the first time that evening, he seemed smaller than the space around him. It is standard when investor capital is being used to stabilize a company with unresolved governance issues, she said. No anger, no tremor, just language so clean he could not argue without looking afraid of it. Vanessa rose from her seat then, perhaps intending to leave before the story hardened into headlines. But two photographers turned when she moved, and she sat back down as if the chair had become safer than the exit. Claire did not look at her. The documents did that for her. Marin turned one page, and the thin sound of paper seemed louder than the string quartet in the corner, which had stopped playing without anyone noticing. Until the review is complete, Claire continued, all discretionary executive expenses will require Brooks Capital approval. All contracts connected to personal relationships will be suspended pending verification of business purpose. Any department head who cooperates fully will be protected from retaliation. A murmur ran through the employees at the side tables. Not fear this time. Relief. Claire heard it, small but unmistakable, and something inside her softened without changing shape. This had never been only about Richard. It was about the people who stayed late, answered support tickets, fixed code, managed clients, and watched leadership spend confidence faster than revenue. It was about the company she had helped build before her name was erased from its story. Richard climbed the first shallow step to the platform, stopping just below her. You are embarrassing me in front of everyone, he said. There it was. Not the company. Not the employees. Not the $75 million keeping the doors open. Him. Claire let the silence answer first. Then she said, No, Richard. I am documenting what you chose to hide. The sentence settled over the room with a kind of quiet finality. Vanessa lowered her eyes again, but Claire still did not grant her the dignity of becoming the center of the scene. Richard had wanted a spectacle built around another woman. Claire gave him a balance sheet instead. Nathaniel returned to the microphone. Brooks Capital will proceed under these terms, pending board ratification tonight. The board chairman stood slowly, adjusting his jacket as though the fabric had become too tight. The board has reviewed the emergency governance package, he said, his voice dry but clear. We will ratify. Richard turned toward him. Martin. One name, full of warning, history, and disbelief. Martin did not meet his eyes. The company comes first. For the first time all night, Richard had no sentence ready. The charm left him in stages. First the smile, then the posture, then the warm authority he had worn like a tailored coat. What remained was a man staring at the woman he had seated in the back, realizing she had arrived with the only future that still existed. Claire closed the folder and picked it up against her chest. Her ivory dress looked almost plain beneath the lights, and somehow that made her more impossible to dismiss. She turned from the microphone and stepped down from the platform. This time, people moved aside before she reached them. Not because she demanded it, because the room had finally learned where power was standing. Claire did not look back when the room opened for her. That was the part Richard would remember long after the headlines softened and the board minutes became archived files. Not the investment number, not Nathaniel's calm announcement, not even the moment the chairman chose the company over him. He would remember Claire walking past rows of people who had once ignored her, carrying the black leather folder like it weighed less than all the years she had spent protecting him. At the edge of the ballroom, Richard finally moved. Claire, he said, louder this time, and the sound followed her across the carpet. She stopped near the tall windows, where Manhattan glittered beyond the glass in clean, indifferent lines. The city did not care, who had been embarrassed inside the Meridian Grand. It simply kept shining, as if dignity had always known how to survive without permission. Richard approached carefully, lowering his voice when he reached her. Behind him, Vanessa remained at the front table, still seated, still beautiful, still suddenly irrelevant. We should talk privately, he said. Claire turned just enough to face him. About the company? His mouth tightened. About us. For the first time that evening, something almost like sadness moved through Claire's eyes, not because she wanted him back, but because she could finally see how little he understood of what had been lost. There is no us in that file, she said. Richard glanced toward the cameras and then back at her, trying to assemble the version of himself that used to work. The warm voice, the wounded expression, the suggestion that every problem was only a misunderstanding waiting for her forgiveness. You know I was under pressure, he said. The board, the lenders, the valuation, everything was closing in. I made mistakes, but you and I built this together. Claire held the folder closer, not defensively, simply because it belonged with her now. Yes, she said. We built it together. Then you told the world you built it alone. His face shifted. The truth had reached a place charm could not cover. I never meant to erase you. Claire looked past him toward the stage where Marin was speaking quietly with the legal officer, where Nathaniel was signing a second document, where employees stood in small stunned groups, as if fresh air had entered a locked building. You did not have to mean it, she said. You benefited from it. The words were not sharp, but they left no room to hide. Richard looked older beneath the chandelier light, not because his face had changed, but because the story around him had. He was no longer the founder with the loyal woman in the shadows. He was a man who had confused being protected with being untouchable. Claire, he said again, softer now. You are still my wife. She reached into her ivory clutch and removed a slim envelope, folded once, sealed cleanly, carried all evening without ceremony. She placed it on the small cocktail table between them. Not for long. Richard stared at it, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Claire did not explain. The divorce papers had been prepared weeks ago, not in anger, not in panic, but with the same clarity she had brought to every report. A legal ending for something that had already ended in 1,000 smaller ways. He touched the envelope, but did not pick it up. After everything? He asked. Claire gave him the mercy of a direct answer. Because of everything. Near the front of the room, Vanessa stood at last, gathered her small silver purse, and walked toward the side exit without looking at either of them. No one followed her. That, too, was a kind of truth. Richard watched her leave, then looked back at Claire as if expecting jealousy, bitterness, some sign that she was still trapped in the performance he had written for her. Claire offered him none. She only stepped away from the table, the city lights catching the pearls at her ears, turning them briefly into small moons. Nathaniel met her near the doors, not with possession, not with rescue, but with professional respect. "The car is ready whenever you are," he said. Claire nodded. Before she left, she looked once more across the ballroom. At the stage. At the hidden place card tucked inside the program. At the employees who would still have jobs on Monday. At the man who had tried to make her absence his proof of success, only to learn her silence had never been surrender. Then she walked out beneath the soft gold lights of the hotel corridor, her steps unhurried, her name restored, her future finally unshared. She did not destroy him. She simply stopped protecting him.